For today and even next class period, we're going to be looking at some of the developments that occurred in the western portion of the church. We'll look at the eastern portion of the church later. And so what we're going to examine is looking at the collapse of the Imperial Church and then its resurrection in the western portion from the years about 400 to 800. And then today we'll also look at the development of Augustinian theology, which developed during this time and became very crucial for theological thinking in the western part of the church. So let's begin first of all by looking at the collapse and resurrection of the Western Imperial Church that occurred from the years about 400 to 800. On the handout that I sent to you, there you notice I started with a picture, and this is of one of the Visigoths who sacked Rome in the year 410. And that's sort of an artist, sort of an imaginative picture that an artist put together of what it would look like to having this Visigoth ruler setting in the imperial locales of Rome at that time. Well, when we look at the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, it occurred primarily in the 5th century. It started really as early as 410 when the Visigoths sacked Rome. Again in the year 455, the Vandals sacked Rome. And then in 476, the last Roman emperor in West, not the East now, but the western part of the Roman Empire, was deposed by a barbarian ruler. And so we usually mark that as the end of the Roman Empire in the West. And this meant, of course, that the Western Imperial Church did not have a political power with which it could align itself. You will recall that when Constantine, in the early 4th century, adopted Christianity, Christianity soon became the official preferenced religion of the Roman Empire. And at that point, the church became an imperial church. It was connected with the political power of the Roman Empire of that time. And now what happened is that the whole western portion of the Roman Empire had been overrun by these various Germanic tribes, whether it was the Visigoths, the Vandals, or others. And now the church really did not have a political power that it could rest upon as it had with the rulers of the Roman Empire after Constantine. So this brought a sort of a crisis for the church in the West and knowing how to deal with it. And to give you an idea of the territorial impact that this had, what you can do is take out your textbook of Gonzalez and compare the map of the Roman Empire that is on page 20 with the map of what was left of the Roman Empire on page 270. And of course, that map on page 270 will also show you the areas that these various tribes took control over that had invaded in this time. Now, most of these tribes had no connection really with Christianity very much. And so as a result, you had rulers and a population that had moved into these areas as well that really did not have much connection at all with Christianity. And this put the church in the West in sort of a crisis situation because for now, over a century or more, the church had worked in close cooperation with political rulers, and now there were no political rulers that it could easily connect with. Now, when we look at what happened to the Roman Empire in the East, we see that it was still able to control its territory, and it remained intact with its capital, Constantinople, which was the capital in the East that Constantine had established around the year 330. There were some powerful rulers that were in the Roman Empire in the East during this period of 400 to 800. Perhaps one of the most powerful was Justinian, who was the Eastern Roman Emperor from 527 to 567, and he was able to make some conquest of territory in North Africa that had formerly been a part of the Roman Empire. But of course, that area will be lost in about a century later to the Arab conquest that we'll talk about more in an upcoming class. So the imperial church in the East did experience some loss now during this time. It experienced some loss due to dissenting church movements, such as the Nestorian church, or the Monophysite church, the Coptic church. All of those did pull away some people from connection with the imperial church for a time. But really the thing that they lost most of their impact with was through the growth of Islam in portions of what had been the Eastern Imperial Church. But still, in spite of that, the Eastern Imperial Church was able to maintain its union with the ruling emperors of this Eastern Roman Empire, which became known as the Byzantine Empire. So if in your reading in the textbook or in other books, you run across that term, the Byzantine Empire, it is that portion of the old Eastern Roman Empire with its capital in Constantinople that Constantine had established in 330. So while the Western Church was experiencing a tremendous upheaval, there was less of an upheaval occurring in the Eastern Imperial Church of that time. Let's look at some of the struggles of the Western Imperial Church during this time, because that's what we're really wanting to look at more. The Western Imperial Church, of course, experienced an organizational collapse with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, because once the church had been adopted by the Roman emperors, the church really set itself up on the political boundaries that had been established within the Roman Empire. And once the western part of the Roman Empire collapses, and those boundaries no longer mean anything because different rulers have come in and conquered the territory that are non-Christian, the organizational structure of the Western Imperial Church collapses as well. So they not only lost their political favors of the Roman government, they really also lost their church's organizational structure at the same time. Now, during this time of about that 400-year period of 400 to 800, the Bishop of Rome became increasingly the leading organizational church figure in the Western Church. In a sense, he was really becoming the Pope of the Western Church. probably the key and most powerful bishop of Rome during that period of time was Pope Gregory. And the textbook tells you a little bit about Pope Gregory's background. But really, I think we could say at least by the time of Pope Gregory and all that he had done, he was really recognized as the leader of the Western Church at this point in time. In that sense, he's really becoming the Pope, not just by claim, but by actuality, the leader of the Western Church. Now, his communication, of course, throughout the entire region where the Western Church had been located was limited. And his authority was challenged at times. And probably his communication and authority was most challenged by the Celtic Church, which we'll look at next week more in detail. But nonetheless, the Bishop of Rome was becoming more and more the looked upon single authoritative leader of the Western Church. The monasteries in the West really became the strongest centers of preserving Christianity in the West during this era. So while the monasteries at one time had been set up to sort of distance people away from this imperial church, it was these monks and nuns and such that really probably did the most of preserving the life of Christianity during this period of 400 to 800 when there was so much chaos occurring politically in the West and impacting the Western Church. Eventually, by the year 800, the Western Imperial Church was resurrected in a sense. It found a new political power with which it could connect itself and align itself as it had done with the Roman empires after the era of Constantine. And really, the power that they aligned themselves with was during the 8th century when there was a rising political power in Central Europe, and that was the Franks. The Franks were becoming the dominant power in Central Europe at that time. And one of the ways in which they really established themselves as the central power was beginning with their pushback against the Arab or the Muslim invasions that were occurring at that time. In the year 711, Europe began to experience the Arab conquest in the Iberian Peninsula. That's what we would call Spain and Portugal today. And they fell under Muslim rule. And the Muslim armies were continuing to march forward and advancing into Central Europe when the Frankish ruler, Charles Martel, defeated them at the Battle of Tours in the year 732 and halted their check into Central Europe and contained them in the Iberian Peninsula. And of course, this got the attention of the Bishop of Rome and the church, because now they were seeing a very significant political power in the Frankish kingdom with which they maybe could align themselves. And of course, this came to fruition when Charles Martel's grandson, known as Charlemagne, was crowned by the Pope in the year 800 as the ruler of what was called then a new Holy Roman Empire in the West. And this meant now that we had really two imperial churches. There was the imperial church in the east, which was connected with the Byzantine Empire with its capital in Constantinople. And then now there was a Western imperial church that was connected with the Frankish rulers under the name of the new Holy Roman Empire in the West. And so now we no longer have a single imperial church that Constantine had envisioned. Now we had two separate imperial churches that were connected with two different political powers, two different kingdoms, two different sets of rulers that really had no connection at all with each other. And so when we look at this Holy Roman Empire, this Western Imperial Church that was developing, it was now running sort of on an axis through Italy, Central Europe, or the Frankish Empire, which we would know as France today, and some of southern Germany, and on up into the British Isles. And so this was going to become the Western Church, the Western Imperial Church. And the Eastern Imperial Church is going to be connected with that Byzantine Empire that we were talking about around Constantinople. Well, this is sort of the big picture of all of that reading that you were doing in the textbook with different names of rulers and such. And I know that sometimes it's very easy to get confused when you're reading all of that to get the big picture. So I wanted to give you a very brief and succinct lecture here that could give you sort of a 20,000 foot aerial view down of what was happening in the world at that time, of these political changes and how it was impacting the church. And so that's the sort of the summary way of understanding what was happening with the imperial church from the year 400 to 800. Now, next class period, we'll look also at a very significant movement in the church that started in Ireland and happened during this same time frame, that was a tremendously strong missionary movement that was not connected with the imperial church, and had a whole different strategy and way of relating to things that was not so deeply enmeshed in the political powers as it was more in the missionary effort of monks as they would go to the various Celtic cultured peoples of that day. And so we'll learn more about them next week, but this is one aspect of what was happening in the church, more specifically the imperial church, during this period of 400 to 800.